Hey everybody, how's it going? This is going to be the first podcast episode of alt-right philosophy, and rather than discussing specific issues, what I'm going to discuss is a more philosophical approach to issues related to the alt-right, and things such as political philosophy and um, you know propaganda methods and things like that. So, in this particular podcast, what I'm going to be talking about is how the left uses language in order to win arguments and control minds. So, let me break a few things down for you. Basically, what the left does, what the social justice warriors or whatever you want to call them do, and I almost don't like the phrase social justice warrior because it kind of degrades. Again, you have to pay attention to the language that's being used, and that's what this whole thing is about. The phrase social justice warrior, as it's been used by the alt-right and just by the alt-right and everybody else, I think it degrades the importance of who these people are and what they're doing and the level of the war we're in, where maybe it's closer to like the Cultural Revolution of Communist China, right? Or like some kind of massive shift in thought or policy for the country. But we're kind of just degrading it, not degrading it, but lessening its importance by using this term, oh, social justice warriors, they're so funny. They're not funny, and it's serious. And what happens is that by calling them this and by thinking it's funny, you're not taking it seriously enough. Because when people can lose their jobs, when they can lose their lives over this, when people can be attacked violently over this, people can be killed over this, it's not funny anymore. So that's that on social justice warriors. Now, what they do is they use language in order to frame the argument, right? When they argue, when they debate, or when they talk, the way they work is they use the language that they use, the way that they phrase things, makes it so they already won the argument without having to win the argument, because what they're doing is they're guiding your mind down a path and setting boundaries for how you think. And as long as you think within that path, it doesn't matter whether you go left or right, they're still guiding you down the path. So here, I'm going to break down just a couple terms to make an example, not to make this video too long, and you can see what you think of it for yourself. So here's what I'm going to break down. Two words or terms, two terms and two phrases. The terms are person of color and racism, and the two phrases related to that are: we need to talk about racism in this country, and we need to talk about the treatment of people of color in this country. Now, those seem like very reasonable things to say when they're said on national television. People think, oh, okay, well, we better listen to this. Maybe they have a valid point. I'm not saying that they don't ever have any valid points, but you can kind of see where, when I break this down, you'll see that it's a much more radical message that's packaged in such a way to make you more accepting of it. Because if they actually spoke what they meant, then people would not be so accepting of it, and you'll see why. So the first term is person of color. Now, who is a person of color, right? We know white people are not people of color. But okay, Muslims, like Arabs, Middle Easterners, they're people of color. Black, African, that whole area. So we covered all of Africa, we covered all the Middle East. All of Latin, South America, they're people of color. Indigenous people, like Indians and so forth, they're people of color. And even Asians are referred to as people of color. Okay, so what happens is that basically everybody, really, everybody who's not white is a person of color. So why don't they say, when they're speaking, instead of saying person of color, why they don't say, well, all the people, all the non-whites? Because that's who they're really referring to under this umbrella term person of color. Because why not refer to them as black or African American or Hispanic or Chinese, Mexican, for example, right? Guatemalan, whatever. They refer to them as person of color because rather than identifying with their actual identity, it's not about their identity. The term is about defining anybody who's not white. So a much more accurate term is non-whites, because that's who the actual term is defining. But by using this term person of color, it confuses that, and it makes it more palatable to the ears, right? Because they try to make it seem not like a black-white thing, not like an anti-white thing. Like if they get on the news and they kept saying, well, everybody who's not white, this is not fair to everybody who's not white, and then it'll alert white people, and it'll cause them to think that there's some kind of opposition here, and that everybody who's not white versus everybody who's white, and they're talking about, and then here's the thing, right? When they're talking about persons of color, and the phrase is, we need to talk about the treatment of people of color in this country, right? That's the phrase you'll hear a lot. And when they use this phrase, we need to talk about the treatment of people of color in this country, what they're really saying is, again, people of color refers to everybody who's not white. So when you're talking about the treatment of people of color, you're not talking about the treatment of, let's say, Mexicans by the Chinese, or let's say Nigerians by the Brazilians. When you're talking about the treatment of people of color in this country, what you're talking about is the way that white people treat everybody who's not white. And this is automatically, of course, a racial issue, because why would you be talking about it in those terms, about the treatment of people of color? Because you're talking about it in terms of a racial issue, right? So what I mean by that is it's a racial issue because when you use the phrase, we need to talk about the treatment of people of color in this country, what you're really saying is, now check this, we need to talk about how the white people are racist, right? Because it's not white people don't like the way that economics goes to put gas in the car, right? This is a racial argument. So why would quote, we need to talk about we treat people of color bad, right? In America, who's we? And why would you refer to it in those terms? People of color, what they're saying is white people are racist, and because of their racism, they're treating all the non-whites badly because they're racist, right? So imagine how that would come across on TV, on national television, when somebody, let's say, gets on TV and they say, all the white people are racist, and because of their racism, they're treating everybody who's not white badly because they're so racist, right? And let's say they got on TV and said this. How provocative, how inflammatory, and how much opposition would they create against themselves from the white community by using those terms versus saying, we need to talk about the treatment of people of color in this country, right? So what you can see is the reason that they created these terms and the way they talk like this is to mask their true message, right? Because that sounds kind of vague message, like what does that really mean? But if you break it down to what it means, that's what it means. White people are racist, they treat everybody else bad because they're racist, right? And that's what that whole phrase means. We need to talk about the treatment of people of color in this country. So that very phrase, when they say that, or anything resembling that, it's an accusation on white people that they're racist. and that they treat other people in a racist manner. Just by saying we need to talk about the treatment of people of color in this country, that is exactly what that means. They're basically getting on the air and saying all these white people are racist and they're treating everybody in a racist manner. They're racist against everybody and they treat other people, in a racist manner. But they don't get on TV and say that. They say we need to talk about the treatment of people of color in this country. Right? So just think about that, process that, in the way that language is used, and identify whenever people use these terms like people of color and treatment of people of color, who is we and who are they and who's the people of color and who is we. And when we need to talk about this, right, the treatment of people of color, who is treating who and who's we that needs to talk about it, and when they need to talk about it, what are they expected to say, what are they expected to do, what's the final result, and what's the accusation embedded in that statement. And all of this comes under that umbrella of just this phrase, people of color, and we need to talk about the treatment of people of color in this country. Now the next phrase that I want to actually talk about is the very word itself, racism. So here's the thing about racism. Okay, when people use the word racism, it evokes certain feelings. And a related word to racism that I could just throw in here together with that rather than covering it separately, making a long video, is white supremacy. So when you see these words, racism, white supremacy, right, what are they talking about when they talk about racism? It evokes a certain image. White supremacy evokes a certain image. Let's just put these together and you'll see why racism is really just another word for white supremacy, right? Because when people talk about, we need to talk about racism in this country, who's we, who needs to talk about it, what do they need to say, right? What's the accusation in that statement? What's the implication in that statement? We need to talk about racism in this country. And it implies that there is a problem of racism in this country. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist, there is no problematics. I'm not saying that, I'm just breaking down the language, right? Because I think even when I cover the actual standard definition of what I consider racist, which would be a very bad thing, in my opinion, that there is that kind of problem that happens. So I'm not saying it's always wrong. I just want you to understand what people are saying when they say this. Be careful of it. So when they say that we need to talk about racism in this country, again, it implies that, and again, like I said, this is not necessarily untrue, but just be aware of what they mean. It implies that there is a problem. The problem is racism in this country. That somebody's creating that problem, and therefore somebody is problematic in their behavior, okay, or a group of people are problematic people. Just in that phrase, we need to talk about racism in this country. So, just by virtue of when you hear that on TV, in 99% of cases, what are they talking about? Are they talking about the way that, let's say, we have the rival Hispanic and black gangs and how they treat each other? Is that what they mean when they come on TV and say we need to talk about racism in this country? Do they mean that, maybe the Japanese and the Chinese communities, they don't like each other? Right? I don't think that's what they mean. Do they mean that, there's a lot of Mexicans that maybe don't like white people? I don't think that's what they're talking about, right? What are they talking about 99% of the time? Or when they get on TV and they say that phrase? The people who are creating the racism, who are the problem, who are creating the problematic behavior, is they're talking about white people, right, being racist against people of color. Okay, so the accusation when they say we need to talk about racism in this country is that racism exists, and that when they say we need to talk about racism in this country, that it's a big enough problem that we need to go on TV and we need to have a big national discussion about it. Right? So why don't they just say instead that we need to discuss all the racist white people in this country and how racist they are? Why don't they go on TV and say that we need to discuss the racist white people, how many racist white people there are and how racist they are? because that's what they mean. But when they say that, we need to talk about racism in this country, it creates a very soft, generic, non-defined, kind of terminology that doesn't trigger your mind on these definitions and who they're talking about. And it sounds generic, but we all know who they're talking about, what they're saying. And what they're saying when they say we need to talk about racism in this country is we need to talk about how white people are a problem, because but white people are a big enough problem that they act problematically. And the way they're acting problematically is that they're racist. And we need to get on TV and we need to have a national discussion about how white people are racist against people of color, against everybody who's not white. So in both of these phrases, in both these terms, it always falls on the white people versus everybody else, and the accusation on the white people, again, twice, white people are racist, white people are racist. Right. And to break down the term racism, right, again, I was saying earlier that it evokes certain images, like white supremacy. What do you think of when you think of white supremacy, or when you think of racism, right? It evokes an image of people hurting people, and this is what I'm saying when the words create mind control, and that it's multiple levels of mind control, because it evokes these images, like when you think of racism, white supremacy. I'm not saying this didn't happen or it's not valid, but I'm saying that it is not valid in the way that they use it, because they're evoking these images, these extreme images, into discussions about, all kinds of things. Like recently they're talking about how, like, Dr. Seuss is racist, So what are the images they're evoking when they talk about this? We're talking about people being forced to sit in the back of the bus, lynchings, people burning crosses, all these kind of like things that you see in the films that, again, they did happen, but it evokes these images, right? So when they say we need to talk about racism in this country, but what are they referring to when they talk about that, right? They're referring to something that Donald Trump said, or something that, some conservative Milo Yiannopoulos said, or just in general, any kind of narrative. And we all know now everything falls under racism, right? So I'm not going to have to go into a big description of what falls under racism, because everything falls under racism. And when people talk about, and everything falls under white supremacy nowadays, anything that these people of color, that impedes their agenda or something they don't like or anything like that, in general, it falls under this phrase, right? Racism and people of color. So, so it evokes these images in your mind, and it's used for that purpose. Now, what do I consider to be racism? In my mind, racism is when you look at somebody and you judge them entirely by their race. Like, once you have an opportunity to get to know them, right, you ignore their individual characteristics, you ignore their individual accomplishments, right? And you basically say, go to the back of the bus, or you say, or you mistreat that person somehow. Like, oh, well, he's successful, he's college educated, he's intelligent, and he has valid points, but he's black, so F him. That's what I would consider to be racism, right? But nowadays, I think that's what evokes in people's minds too when they think about this term racism, but it's now evoked over everything, right? So again, let's reach all back to the beginning. We need to talk about racism and the treatment of people of color in this country. Specifically right now, when you talk about racism in this country, they're talking about all these little things that they're bitching about, Dr. Seuss and what Donald Trump said, and the handshake and hand symbol that somebody gave in the White House of okay, and all this ridiculous shit that they put under racism and everything else, right? And we all know what that is. I don't have to explain it. But they're evoking these images, and they say we need to talk about racism in this country, or they speak about racism. Every time they bring that up, it's like the definition is, we need to talk about white people that judge everybody who's not white entirely by their race, and treat them badly, and even perhaps violent acts like segregation by force and lynching and beatings and cross burning, right? and just treating people badly by race alone, and how all the or not necessarily all, but how this is a big problem among white people, and we need to get there and talk about it, right? So instead of talking about we need to talk about racism, we need to talk about the treatment of people of color in this country, and using the words racism, right? What they should get on TV and say is, we need to talk about how there's a big problem with white people in this country, because white people just look at people who are not white, and that they're so dense and so evil that they just look at people and they're willing to throw bricks in their house and burn crosses and put them in the back of the bus, and do all these things because that's what white people do, and white people are racist, and we need to talk about that, right? That's what's really actually embedded in just these two phrases in these words, right? And we've seen that because you think, oh no, that's not true, it's not going into those extremes. But then just recently on the football kneeling thing, is like, I hear people saying, oh, Donald Trump is saying don't kneel, but we won't go to the back of the bus. That's racist. So of course those are the images they're trying to evoke, and they're trying to leverage that, and they're trying to do it subconsciously and through an infiltration. And I don't think that they all necessarily are smart enough to figure out what they're doing, but it was spread out through the culture by people who are smart, who have designed these words either consciously or subconsciously, and designed this language. And I think it is conscious, and it would fall under this cultural Marxism thing of just like these two innocuous sounding things. Oh, we need to talk about racism in this country, we need to talk about the treatment of people of color in this country, and how that just means we need to talk about how there's a big problem with white people in this country, and how white people are so bad and so stupid and so evil that they have this huge problem that they just look at anybody who is not white, and they will be willing to put them in the back of the bus and throw bricks through their windows and hang them and beat them for no reason whatsoever, because they're devils, they're white devils. That's the actual sentences that they should use when they get on TV, instead of saying we need to talk about racism in this country and talk about the treatment of people of color in this country. I'm just saying that's what they mean. I'm not saying that none of them ever have any legitimate points, but I'm just saying that's what they mean. And you should recognize that. And you should recognize the fact that they're using these phrases to cover up their real meanings, because they know if they got on TV and they said that, and they said, we need to talk about the problem with white people in this country, and it's such a big problem that white people are so, quote, racist, that they just look at people and they're willing to be violent against them, and bringing up all these lynchings and hangings and beatings and putting people in the back of the bus, and they're willing to do that to people just because they're a different race alone, and white people are white devils. That's why they're willing to do it, and it's so prevalent of a problem we have to get on TV and talk about it. So when you see somebody, I'd like to see somebody get on TV and say that, right? And then let's see, they say that enough times, and let's see how people start to respond. You get a lot of white people get angry. That's bullshit accusations, right? And so forth. But when they say, oh, we need to talk about racism and the treatment of people of color in this country, right? They're not going to get the white people riled up, but they're infusing the message subconsciously to your mind, right? And they're using it to win the argument by getting you to accept, right, kind of a lot of the underlying premises that, oh, we need to talk about this, but you're accepting all these underlying premises and accusations against white people just by accepting those phrases, and by saying, by not having the same reaction to those phrases as you would have to, we need to talk about the problem of white people in this country and why they're white devils and why it's such a big problem. If you don't have that same level of reaction to them saying we need to talk about racism and the treatment of people of color in this country, then you've already basically began losing the argument, because you accepted their premises, at least to the point where you're not having that reaction where you think, oh, that's legitimate, we need to talk about it. I'm not saying that we don't, but I'm saying that, okay, why don't you just say what you mean, and then we can see if it's valid, if we need to talk about it. And then we can have an accurate perspective, because we can have an accurate accusation, and we can have an accurate argument, rather than these politically correct, to me they make me sick, these disgusting terms like all this kind of double speak, as they would say in 1984 and so forth. And that's all it really is. So again, just think about that. Think about the meaning of words and the language people use and how they use it to frame arguments, and how they use it to win before the arguments even started, how you're allowing them to control your mind by accepting this and not saying, wait a minute, why don't you say what you really mean? Because that would be step one, I think, to challenging these people. Anyway, that's it. Have a good one.